Alright, so it's a lot bigger than our standard points of reference for SFF cases, but I think this is volume really well spent. So today let's peel back the layers on this case, and I'll show you why it's so impressive. Welcome to Machines and More. In the last video, I gave an overview of the case and the features, and this one, the Slate Case AQ from Protolyth, is a very interesting design. I did have an update from them, and this is actually related to what I was mentioning about in the previous video, related to those cutouts at the bottom of the case with the GPU. And in this particular test unit, there's only 2 open slots, even though the clearance for the actual GPU and the cooler, it's much more, but they're telling me that they revisited the design, and in the retail iteration, they are going to open it up to allow for 3 cutouts. So that's great if you have a monstrosity of a GPU and you want to build in this case. Alright, so onto the builds that I'll discuss today. I did this one up 2 ways, and the first I'll discuss is with this traditional bracket here. And this traditional bracket is an option from Protolyth when you purchase the case. I believe it runs $12 in addition to the case, and it allows you to turn the case into a, for lack of a better word, traditional layout. And that's great if you want to run this one without the riser cable. And it's also good if you are considering an air-cooled option, for which I measured 140 millimeters of clearance. So the official quoted spec is 137 millimeters. There's a little bit of wiggle room, not quite enough for the Noctua D12L though. To install, you take off the riser cable bracket and you swap in this piece for the bottom, and when this is installed, your GPU, it will slot into the motherboard's expansion slot directly, and the GPU will hang on the hangers here. Done this way, you have the freedom of allocating radiator and fan space however you like it still. You can turn the ensemble to face the left or the right, but for the radiator space, you are at the mercy of how thick your GPU is, and with this particular EVGA XE3 card, which isn't a thick card, I could fit the Cooler Master PL240 rad plus 2 25mm fans here, but I did have to resort to the NFA 12x15 slim fans at the other end, if that gives you an idea of how much clearance you have. And one of the reasons for this is just the way the power connector protrudes at the top of the PSU. This is a stock cable that Protolyth provides, so I think perhaps there's a little bit of wasted space here from that larger plug, and perhaps some room for optimization in the future. The build components here are mostly consistent with the test kit that I use for testing other SFF cases. Here we have the Asus B550i with the 3700X, 3080 XC3, and FSP did send over their 850 watt Dagger SFX supply, and I did check it out here, so big thanks to them. And for the cooler, I stuck to the 240mm unit you have here, the PL240 from Cooler Master, although you can certainly go 280, but I really like these fans. And with these upgraded fans, you're really looking at comparable performance between a stock 280 AIO and this sort of souped up 240. For the fan setup, I had these rad fans exhausting, and since the case fans were facing the GPU fans, they did have to run a mandatory intake. Of course, you can also run the rad fans as intake so as to bias the performance towards the CPU, but I did want to get an idea of a higher performing wall-ventilated, thermally optimized gaming setup, and so instead of placing the glass panel over the viewing side like one typically would, I did use a vented panel there, and the glass panel on the back side of the motherboard, because I didn't have another vented panel. Not that you'd set it up this way necessarily, because these are just the 2 panels that the company provided, and I had to make 2 here. For a CPU render with rad fans exhausting, the performance is in the ballpark compared to other cases, and this is with rad fans exhausting. You might want to hone in on the comparison between the similarly set up Meshlicious here, keeping in mind that the particular setup here with the Gen 4 riser is an all-mesh version, but the addition of the case fans with the Slate case does help the CPU thermals a bit. And these are quite good numbers that it puts up, certainly nothing surprising here. But where we can really see the strengths of this case is with the GPU temps, and with gaming we see some really great GPU thermals, much better than the Meshy with slightly higher CPU temps, and higher CPU temps with this case than say compared to the vented NR200, which does allow a side intake option, which helps the CPU, plus 4 case fans. So quick check for a combined stress test here, and in this configuration we do have much better GPU temps compared to the Meshlicious, while having slightly worse CPU temps. So traditional bracket. This thing, it looks intriguing like this, and combined with the vertical display of the case plus the traditional layout, it's definitely a conversation starter. And I didn't have any particular issues with this GPU in terms of the width, but you will have less clearance in this mode. And that is also dependent on the location of your power connector, so do keep that in mind if you have a really, really wide GPU. With this case, I didn't run the rear I/O shield since, let's face it, you don't see the rear I/O, and I found it helpful to use that opening for cable management. So overall, I think the traditional bracket is an interesting option. I wouldn't get this case solely just to run it like this or for an air-cooled build, since there are less boutique options that can get you similar build options with less constraint. But as a card to keep in your back pocket, it's definitely worth the $12 if you're getting the case anyway. But the main event here is the vertical layout, and paired with liquid cooling, this is where this case starts to really excel. I set up this case with the GPU shifted out since the test card does play nicely with this type of setup, although it does diminish the clearance over the motherboard, which oddly forced the tubing into a very odd location like this, and I did have to take a page out of the NR200P Max's playbook and tie the tubes down with the PSU cables. And I did find the cabling aspect of the build a bit more nuanced compared to other sandwich style cases that I've built in, especially from the rear and front panel I/O cables, because they're coming from both the front and the back. And the power cable, everything kind of just crossed paths in a sort of weird, awkward fashion. And I do have to admit here, this is not the best cable management job that I could have done. But you know, this PSU has an egregious amount of cable length that out of stock, out of the box. But even absent that, there's just a lot of cables running crisscross to and from the motherboard, and that's just a result of having both front and rear panel I/O. The other potential build consideration that this type of cabling introduces is that you can't really just expect to pull out the core, do your build, and then slide everything all back in, because the rear and the front panel I/O cabling is attached to the rad panels. So you do have to kind of think about how you're going to connect the cables up. So either you do it first and then have the panels kind of half hanging, or you slide the core back in and then you connect the cables up in the case. But either way, just make sure you have a plan. Otherwise, you might find yourself disconnecting and reconnecting things quite a bit to get it back into the case here. The other thing is, once you build into it, you'll find that the radiator space does quickly diminish without perfect cable management. Again, that power plug, it does reduce the usable space a little bit, but with my less than religious cable management, and I was focused more on getting it to work well rather than look well. With this combination, I had more than enough room for the case fans. I think you could easily do T30s on that side if you wanted, but the AIO tubing, it's a little bit unruly. I think you can put all those inconveniences in the rear view mirror when you consider just how well this case performed. For this build iteration, I placed the glass panel on the motherboard side and I vented the GPU side, and with both sets of fans exhausting, and this will really encourage the makeup air to come in through this side panel and feed both the graphics card and the radiator, and there's enough space here that it can serve both. And while exhaust is a slightly less preferable orientation for those that are more concerned about the CPU, I don't really think it's going to sway things one way or another in a less than critical environment. But look at those temps here in the combined scenario. And I did want to call out that these aren't strictly noise normalized between all these cases, but the rad fans are, and the GPU fans are the exact same speed. So while the noise might differ slightly, these are mostly the same. And where case fans are used, they are at levels that don't significantly affect noise, usually less than 1,000 RPM, and in this case at exactly 1,000 RPM. I have it running right now, and hopefully you can get a good idea of what it sounds like. There's nothing odd about this case in terms of noise. It doesn't amplify the sound. Basically, whatever's inside, whatever's running, it's going to come through. With so much ventilation, not much insulation. If you have a glass panel here, that's going to cut down on that a little bit, but this is not offensive at all. And I think at these levels, I think it's a very comfortable gaming level. One thing I will note is that because of the placement of the AIO pump head, if you do run an AIO, it's almost never going to be at the top where you're going to get air bubbles, right? So as long as part of the radiator is higher than your pump head, it's going to be fine, and it's almost always going to be fine with 240 or 280. So these are the flat-out best temps for these, among the SF cases that I've tested recently. Of course, it's also the biggest case on this list. But you do have to keep in mind it is using a solid glass panel on one side here. One more sanity check here with the combined stress tests. Best GPU thermals, and it is rivaling the vented NR200. Again, keeping in mind this is with a glass panel. Not that a dual vented setup would necessarily perform better here, and getting into the strength of this case, where the Protolyth design really excels is prioritizing the airflow where it needs to go. You've got a solid top here, mostly solid bottom, and the glass panel on the motherboard side leaves this one side panel available for makeup airflow. In that air, it comes in towards the GPU side. It's forced to basically be made up through here, coupled with the enormous airflow holes on the side and the front and rear panels. That's why this is a winner in the performance department. And to call this a result of simply being a larger case would be a little bit lazy. Yeah, it is a larger case, but it's how it's using that extra space that matters. And I think the thoughtful airflow, the key thing here being the flow, right? Because what goes in needs to come out. And, overall, that's what makes this work. And consider this. It can rival the similarly sized vented NR200 while using 2 fewer case fans. Okay, another strength of the case is the modularity and flexibility for the user. There are just so many things that you can do with it. In fact, too many for me to test in the span of the week and a half or so that I've had it. For example, it does come with potential compromises, but if you wanted to, you can order these extra aluminum feet, and these not aluminum, this is sintered nylon that they test with. But you could turn the case horizontally, and then after relocating the rear I/O panel, you would have a sandwich style NR200. And if you really wanted to, you could do that, but more practically, this dovetail rail system, it does let you choose which side to display. And if you're using an AIO, you can put the rad on either the front or the back, whatever you want, and you can give it just the right amount of rad clearance. You know, your pump head positioning is not a big deal here. So there's just a lot of freedom, and even amongst users that have the same case, you can end up with very dramatically different builds. These panels are very thick and heavy. I noted the build quality was no joke here, and these magnets are definitely no joke. And, that tubing that was a little bit uncooperative when I was building it. Who cares when you got magnets like these, right? So overall, very good package here. I did note a few potential points of improvement, if you will. First off, we talked about this layout in the last video, and that bottom-facing motherboard I/O is a potential deterrent. And if you're fine with just the rear and front panel I/O, coupled with the display port out from that adapter, I think this is really not going to be an issue for you. But just in testing the case and having to pivot the case up, for example, to attach the Wi-Fi antenna, I can see how that's going to get old for some of you. And while you're doing that, make sure that the right angle DisplayPort adapter stays in, because it's not barbed and it can absolutely slip loose enough to drive your display just a little bit wonky, and you'll have to lift it up and push it back in. The extra void at the bottom does make it a taller case than the components inside actually can occupy, and that is vertical space instead of taking up additional footprint, so that is a consolation there. But this particular design, it just necessitates more volume, and I think the numbers do say it all, right? Because it is a bigger case on the SFF spectrum. As far as this riser cable goes, this Gen 3 cable might give you pause. It's definitely going to be giving you some inconvenience if you have a Gen 4 compatible board and GPU. But what I am seeing is that if there is enough case interest here, Protolyth is going to upgrade all of them to Gen 4. So hopefully that does happen, because I think that's going to be a really solid upgrade there. Next, the optimal airflow, that layout, it's going to involve exhaust. So if hot air coming into your vicinity might be annoying, keep that in mind, especially for extended gaming sessions. It's not going to be coming at your face, such as with a side exhaust. But this is one common issue with vertical cases, and not just this one. So I built this up with the rad placed at the back to kind of mitigate the hot air, but you still have GPU exhaust that's coming out through the front, right? On that note, the case has no dust filters so far, and with all these intakes from the side panel, I would have liked to see a filter as a built-in option, meaning if you want great performance and you want to blow out the case every few weeks, go ahead and go filterless. Otherwise, a few pieces of mesh here would have been ideal for most users, and really you would just need it mainly for this side panel. But I think with these big air holes, you're going to have some dust issues pretty soon. And it could have been this particular test unit, but the GPU's hold down mechanism still left the card a little bit loose, and I would have liked a little more security there. Also a visual indicator along the rails that show if the assembly is square after you slide it back in. Something simple like etched and numbered notches would be sufficient here, because I wasn't sure if I was putting the whole assembly back in perfectly or not, and it does have a little bit of play that it could angle off to one side. Potentially a larger cut on the tray to allow access to a rear M.2 drive that's under the motherboard would be nice. But those latter things are all quality of life improvements, and really if you are okay, the primary thing being if you're okay with the size and the rear I/O layout, there really aren't too many major downsides for this, even for a first generation upstart product. So, premium small run product here with a high cost of entry. Who is this case for? Well, the interesting observation I had here is that despite it being such a modular and freedom-oriented case to build in, coupled with the price and these highlight features, this type of user that this will cater to will probably be a lot more narrow than the versatility might suggest. First off, if you're after flexible liquid cooling, excellent. There's really not going to be any better choice if you want to do a dual 280 custom loop. This is going to be one of your best performing SFF cases, if not one of the few SFF cases that you can do it with out of the box. So whether you go an AIO or custom loop, this is performance is going to be excellent here. Yes, you can get excellent performance in something like the Lee & Dan A4H2O, which is almost half the volume of this, but you really have zero freedom in that case. You just have to build it exactly within the confines, right? You can't adjust anything. If you want a dual rad setup, two 240s or 280s, and I do want to caution you that you will have to still be very deliberate about cable management for that setup, but you can absolutely make it work in this case. And so, look no further than this case, because all the other options that are more mainstream, like your NR200, you're gonna have to mod the case if you want the two rads at the top and the bottom. Even if you're building with just an EIO, if you want the ability to fine-tune your airflow with case fans for maximum performance, not too many cases will let you do that right now. And as you've seen, by doing that, the performance is very impressive, and this is going to be an excellent choice. And personally, I'd have absolutely no qualms about getting one glass panel and one vented panel, and I think this is quite a good configuration here. What I wouldn't get this case for, and you probably know this already from seeing the review, is if you're getting this with the intention of just using the traditional bracket and doing it as an air-cooled setup. I mean, yeah, it can work, but unless you're madly in love with how this case looks, and yeah, it's a really cool looking case, but I think there are a lot of lower cost options that will simply allow you to do that with bigger air coolers, and even though I feel like the functionality is there, I just don't feel the need to go there with this case. The other thing is that I don't mean to sell the aluminum foot option short, but if you're getting this with the intention of just flipping it the other way, and you don't want to run it vertically, then I feel like you're really passing on the allure of this case's form factor, and perhaps what you really need is a case that just has rear-facing I/O from the ground up, and that's going to save you some volume too. At the end of the day, what you have here is a sort of case within a case, a niche within a niche, and a sandwich within a sandwich. And if you're after what it can do, well, it kind of stands vertically on its own. So this brings us to the end of this look here. I'm not sure how much longer I can borrow this guy for, so that may be the extent of the content for now. Again, big thanks to Protolyth for letting us take a look here. And I do hope to take another look when the final retail revisions are in place. And yeah, I'm super excited for all of you that have pre-ordered it, because I think you're absolutely going to love this case. So build links down below. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Give a like. Thanks for watching. Perhaps what you need is a rain delay.